Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green. We're going to focus in this episode on India, the U.S. India relationship, India's strategic play on the chessboard, and what the heck is happening between Donald Trump and Narendra Modi. We could not be better served in that mission than by having Dr. Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow in the Center for Asia Policy Studies at Brookings in Washington, D.C., one of the leading experts on India in a political, but especially a strategic context. Lots to discuss. Tanvi, thanks for joining.
Thanks, Mike. I've been a long-time listener, and I'm really glad to be on the show.
So we do this thing, which I think people are interested in, where we sort of tell your origin story. How did you get into this? I understand you were growing up in New Delhi on a trajectory that would have made you a tech sis, technology billionaire. You could have funded Brookings, but something happened. Tell us what happened.
The road not taken. I grew up in India, in New Delhi in the 1980s, and a bit like DC, it's a very political city, and you can't escape that. It's a bigger one horse down. This was especially as the 80s went on and into the 90s, this was just everywhere in the world. So many changes on the international scene. I used to read a lot. We used to do those things in those days, like read newspapers and magazines. And there was this one show, there was state-run TV in India, so just the one channel. But every week, there used to be this show called on Friday called The World This Week. And it was my favorite TV show. Because for me, just watching not just what was happening, whether it was in Europe, whether in India's case, the Middle East and what was happening there in the early 90s in particular was very impactful. The fact that not only was momentous changes happening in the world, but that they directly were affecting India, but not just India in terms of foreign policy. For me, it was, and for my family and friends, it was changing India as an economy and society. India had to open up after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the first Gulf War, and that directly impacted my life. And so I like traveling, and that added to it as well. But I was always interested in international relations and also how it could change countries and how countries themselves reacted to world changes.
Yeah, I grew up in D.C. inside the Beltway, so we have similar addictions because my old Boy Scout troop, Troop 52, you'd go camping and one Scoutmaster would be a federal judge and the assistant Scoutmaster would be a diplomat, and there's no escaping it, is there? But you went further away than I did. You went to school at Yale and then on to grad school in the U.S.?
That's right. So I did my undergraduate at a college in Delhi called Lady Shriram, and they were very good. I was a history major, and they actually made you read and study and analyze. And there were some great professors there. So I got the history bug. And then that was my little tech sis. I did about a year and a half of Delhi and Bangalore, taught myself how to code, but then ended up applying to the Yale IR program for my master's. Had a great experience there because it was also a very interdisciplinary program, political scientists, historians, but they used to let us take classes in the business school as well. So just a really interesting way of looking at the world. Then was at Brookings for 3 years as a research assistant working for Jim Steinberg and Steve Cohen, who worked on South Asia. Then decided needed to go get a PhD, wanted to go get a PhD, and did that in public policy at UT Austin at the LBJ school there. I went in thinking I want to, kind of relook at the history of U.S. India relations and what drove it, and stumbled upon the fact that way back even in the 1960s and 50s, China was a driving factor in both good and bad ways. And so I decided to look into that. And since then, have kind of looked at this India, China, U.S. triangle a fair bit in my work, especially since I've been back at Brookings since 2012.
You and I were talking just before we started about the field and how U.S. institutions of higher education are preparing or not preparing the next generation of experts on India, on Japan, on regional affairs. And we're both a little bit worried. I'm just finishing college tours with my son, and there's some outstanding programs. But the other programs you can clearly see where regional studies are in retreat. Part of it's budget cuts that are happening right now, but part of it is the ethos, if you will, the pathology of political science right now and history, which as fields are for different reasons from the left and from the quantitative side and from the postmodernist dimension, kind of de-emphasizing understanding what countries do and how countries interact. And you ended up in a think tank, not a university, which I think is a somewhat common story now for people who do more applied, pragmatic, less postmodernist or quantitative PhDs. But any advice or observations for folks? Think tanks are limited. There's not that many jobs.
I think, advice partly for folks who both kind of on the government side, on the university side, but also on the corporate side, which is both ironic and sad that we are seeing this decline in area studies at the very time the importance of it is so evident. You can't be a business and not think about geopolitics and understand how other countries are reacting today, or having to understand what is going on within countries. The same for government, as we're seeing all this discussion after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech about, middle powers need to get together. And that's a broad statement. So you still have to understand what each country's motivations are. And there's nothing like kind of understanding the ability to put yourself in the other country's position and understand how they're seeing the world. And so to me, both kind of an appeal for funding, but I think, hopefully there are spaces and there will be spaces, whether it's in policy schools or international relations departments, where there's a space for policy relevant area studies, but also going back to things like language study. I know in the days of AI, people think you don't need to do these things, but I think there's still a space for that. To me, the reality of this time is this kind of combination of needing to understand geopolitics, geoeconomics, technology, tells me that today the jobs that are available are not just in think tanks or universities. They could be in the private sector. They could be in risk consultancies. They could be, even in terms of, I would hope, even in teaching in high schools for that matter. But I think there's a broader array of job opportunities potentially available for somebody that is interested in area studies or doing it, and a certain amount of mobility where you don't have to just stay in country. You can actually go and work on these issues in another part of the world.
I think that's right. There are polls, surveys in the last 2 years by Bloomberg and others of CEOs and boards. And the two topics that CEOs of multinationals say we're not prepared for that dominate their thinking now are AI and geopolitics. And it has to be applied. And, I think you and I are on the same page in believing that you kind of need to combine the rigor of political science with the insights of history. The two disciplines are diverging, but to prepare for what you're talking about, you kind of need a bit of a hybrid skill set. All right, let's apply all of this to your favorite topic, one of my favorite topics, the U.S. India relationship, India's position in the world. We'll get to the rupture, or how big a rupture, that started about 6 months ago between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. But I think it's important for people to understand, if you will, the origin story of the U.S.-India alignment. I was there for a good part of it when I was in the White House on the NSC staff with President Bush. I'll just say two things and then get your take on where this came from. But one was we did meetings in the NSC and the Bush campaign beforehand that turned out to be, although I think none of us knew it, very close to a national security memorandum that Ronald Reagan signed in the early 80s, that was later declassified, that said the rise of India is in America's interest, whether India is aligned with the U.S. or not. It was a very structural view of the world, and that was in the 80s. And of course, in the 2000s, that was very true because of China. And I think sometimes people get confused and think we're building an alliance, but in fact, the Indian power in itself has virtue for the U.S. and other democratic allies. The other thing that someone pointed out to me once was the people who really propelled the U.S.-India, what we call next steps in strategic partnership, were not the Indiawallas, with the exception of our friend Ashley Tellis. Almost all of the people working on it were veterans of traditional alliances. Nick Burns with NATO, Torkel Patterson and me with Japan, Bob Blackwell with NATO, Steve Hadley with NATO. I mean, the people who really pushed this forward, I remember some old school India hands telling me in particular, you're just dreaming. So maybe that naivete was a strength. Most of the people I mentioned were kind of maritime allies focused on, and not continentalists thinking about stabilization with China or Russia as the core goal, but thinking more about building a balance of power that favors freedom, as Condi Rice put it. So there's an interesting origin story there, but I honestly came to it without a lot of India prep. And a lot of us, frankly, did. And maybe that was why we succeeded or did not. But you studied this in a lot more detail. Why don't you tell your version of India-U.S. strategic alignment, origin story after the Cold War, and bring in the India part as well, of course.
It goes to what you were saying, Mike, about the importance of understanding the history of it. And I think that is particularly important in the case of the India-US relationship, because it also gives you some perspective about how far the relationship has come in not a very long period. I mean, now we're at about 2.5 decades, I would say, since the last kind of inflection point in the relationship. And I think you see that significant change in 2000, the year 2000, there were, or 99, 2000, there were still US sanctions on India after India's nuclear tests in 1998. But I think you saw at that time, around that kind of 99, 2000, definitely into the Bush administration, this kind of turn in both India and the US, where suddenly they saw the other country as important for their priorities. After a period, and different kind of priorities, I think pretty much every government in India since that period has thought about the US as important, if not, to use a term Prime Minister Modi had, if not indispensable to India's economic and technological transformation, to balancing China, which has been an Indian rival since the late 1950s, early 60s, but definitely in the last decade, decade and a half. But I think for India, there was also an understanding, and I think the nuclear deal that really unlocked a lot on the defense and security cooperation side between the US and India, this understanding that the US could help India also get a seat at certain high tables that India had been excluded from. That the US paved the way, to put it crudely in terms that others had, for India to go from the doghouse to the clubhouse. And it was a partner in that. So I think for India, this idea that the US was useful, and I'm a realist on this. I think, the structural factors matter. Absolutely, individuals do. Individuals like yourself who were there at key moments, who helped drive the relationship, even as naysayers abounded. But I think on the US side as well, initially, I think it was some people thought India was important, including in the business sector, because India was going to be, especially after liberalization, a growing market, not as big as China, but one that could have scale potentially. And then you started having, as the US thought of China in competitive terms, for those who haven't read it, during the 2000 campaign, Condoleezza Rice wrote a piece, an article in Foreign Affairs, where she said, we need to stop thinking about India just in an India-Pakistan context and think about it in India-China context. I think through that prism, through thinking about who are the countries that can, even if they're not aligned with the US or actively cooperating with the US, who can complicate China's calculations? And in an ideal world, do that in partnership with the US. And I think that has been another consistent theme for US administrations, and that, if anything, intensified over the course of the Obama, but also the first Trump administration, and then certainly the Biden administration, seeing India as a geopolitical counterbalance, an economic alternative, on the technology side, more trusted partner, and a democratic contrast in the Asian and the Indo-Pacific environment. So I think, it comes down to having people, and this has always been the case in India-US relations, you need to have real champions of the relationship working against all the folks saying, this is not going to happen. And yes, it is sometimes regional specialist, but having what I call pragmatic ambition, not having unrealistic expectation that India is going to suddenly be an ally, but also not resting on, well, it's not really going to move further, and say, what is the next thing that we can do together?
This is why regional experts need the rigor of political science and the insights of history, because I think a lot of the people telling us this wouldn't work had the historical part, and they'd never seen this before from Peruvian India. They didn't have the political science part, which is how the structural changes, the rise of China, and so forth had an impact. Agency, leadership matter. President Bush, most importantly, Manmohan Singh, and then Modi put a lot of work into this. There were big fights, as people may know, with the non-proliferation community in the U.S., which is pretty powerful on the Hill, with the nuclear and sort of non-aligned elements in the Ministry of External Affairs and Lok Sabha in India. So it was not like natural. It took real political capital from the leaders. The other piece that matters in strategy and international affairs is values and culture. And a lot of people poo-poo the idea that India and the U.S. share common democratic values, but I think it's richer than people sometimes recognize when you look at the diaspora in particular, but also views of the United States in Pew and other surveys. Usually the India's much more positive about the U.S., and I'm not just talking about Trump, ever, than Europe, for example. So I think there is some, I don't know if it's common values exactly, maybe it's common destiny. I don't know if that's too Chinese. I don't know what you call it, but I assume having lived in both places and going back and forth, you sense some of that what unites the American and Indian people in ideational terms is far greater than what would divide.
I think that's right. And for me, I see the change even in cultural references in India, the kind of British pop culture references or television or literature used to be so much more dominant in India in the 80s and to some extent the 90s. But, I always joke that one of the things that happened when India liberalized is suddenly you got cable TV. And a lot of that cable TV was American soap operas playing in prime time. So things like there were these shows called Bold and the Beautiful and Santa Barbara, and people saw, America in a very different way, not just how they had heard about the US. And obviously, how the US treated India was very different over time as well. But, especially I think the things that changed were things like you saw this around the Y2K problem. Suddenly you saw a lot of engagement on the tech side and then Indian engineers and others coming here. So you saw another wave of, legal immigration, but you also of high-skilled immigration. But then I think you also saw the number of students, instead of going to the UK if they were going to go abroad, thinking about the US, not just in terms of graduate school. And to this day, about 3/4 of the students who come to the US from India are graduate students, but also for undergraduate. So you see now cultural references because of TV and others, and a lot of American entertainment companies there and channels. The references are all much more American. They're obviously Indian as well, but even in terms of, you'll see Modi does an inauguration now. For example, there's a swearing-in ceremony has been turned into like we have here in the U.S. inauguration. So it's very interesting how it's become dominant. I think the bridge that is the English language has helped. I think the bridge that are students and those people-to-people ties. And I think this is something Prime Minister Modi understood when, he could have come in. He'd been banned from coming to the U.S. for a while. When he became Prime Minister, I think there were structural reasons he thought the U.S. was important. But he pushed the bounds on the relationship as Prime Minister Manmohan Singh did, because I think they understood that whatever the strategic community, however skeptical it was in Delhi and other places of the U.S., that the street was U.S. friendly, that the street had connections to the US because family members were studying there or somebody worked for an American company in India. And so I think that changed. So in this moment of challenge that we've had in the relationship in the last 6 months, part of what I'm worried about is if you have a period where the street starts changing its mind, the Indian street starts changing its mind in the US, it will constrain the Indian Prime Minister's hand in terms of what he's able to do with the US.
2 years ago, I was in New Delhi for the U.S. India dialogue that Ananta Center runs, and we went to Republic Day, the magnificent display of Bengal Lancers and Pipers and Camel Corps and jet fighters. And the MEA put these former American officials, none of us were current, in the front row, ahead of acting ambassadors from most of the rest of the world, except for Japan. And we were all formers, we were has-beens. It kind of, well, the ambassadors behind us were pretty unhappy about it. There was something there. And what was envisioned 20 years ago hasn't all happened. I think a lot of us expected that the U.S. nuclear industry would have a big role in India, and that climate change. The Bush administration, believe it or not, believed that there'd be reductions in emissions because the nuclear cooperation would get India away from coal. That has not happened, either of those things, as much as people wanted. On the other hand, the defense relationship is incredibly strong, maybe more than people expected. And the other part that isn't talked about much, but I had a bit of a front row seat for, before the U.S.-India rapprochement, India's relations with Japan, with Australia, with Korea, and with the EU were also languishing. And I think that the Manmohan Singh government, and of course people like Jai Shankar, who's now Modi's foreign minister, were instrumental in it. I think they probably saw that getting the U.S. relationship on track was going to open a much broader multipolar set of opportunities for India. To get Japan past the nuclear test sanctions, to get Australia past it, because Australia had banned uranium exports to India. And so there are a whole bunch of other diplomatic relationships opened up. Not formally, they had relations, but sort of flourished. Most of these bilateral relationships are not celebrated as successes of the U.S.-India relationship. And I'm not in Washington, so maybe I'm less biased, but I think they are, and were deliberately, and I know that to be true with Japan, part of the plan for Delhi with the U.S. And frankly, at least for the Bush administration, part of what Washington was thinking. So benefits in some areas, some beyond what was expected. In other areas, perhaps peaceful nuclear cooperation never fully realized. But how would you characterize the overall? But we're going to get to the rupture in just a minute, because episode 4 of this miniseries is really bad, but we're not there yet. So before the rupture, how would you assess the overall trajectory and sort of state of the relationship?
I mean, even for people like me who, would say that stop saying, I'd often say that to folks here in America, don't stop being ambitious and don't say India's not going to do this. Keep asking, because India might say no today, but it's really just a not yet, and they will do more. And even I was surprised how much India was doing with the US. I had thought it would take at least another 10 years. Now, some of this is thank you, Xi Jinping, who really focused the mind with border crises in 2017 and 2020 in particular. And you saw administrations, the Trump administration, the Biden administrations, reciprocate and say they were willing to do things and fight the bureaucratic battles within to say yes to India. And so you saw, I think, really unprecedented, and as a historian, I don't use that word lightly, but a really unprecedented defense and security cooperation. Also technology, which went from becoming, as you know, during the Bush administration, export controls in India was such a bugbear, many of which had been imposed after kind of the 70s and what India called its peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. But then also after its 98 nuclear test, there were all these export controls on India that were affecting not just, as you said, the U.S. Ability to work with India, but also a number of Western countries. Technology has now gone from becoming a bugbear in the relationship to another one of those bridges and areas of cooperation where, you've had India welcome American companies in a way that earlier people had said, India just will not make choices, that it will just, want to shut out all foreign firms. In the technology sphere, India is choosing, and it is often choosing to work with the US. It's not walking this middle path. It likes its own independent capabilities, but where it doesn't have those in terms of telecom, in terms of AI, in terms of developing a semiconductor industry, it is working very closely with the US. And the thing that I say is, I'll give you one thing in terms of one example or vignette in terms of the change in the relationship is if you go back to the early 1980s, you had Indira Gandhi complaining about US military activities in Diego Garcia, which in the Indian Ocean. And she said it was a bigger threat to regional stability than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Just a few months ago, you had the US and India with their P-8s, these maritime reconnaissance aircraft, doing a joint patrol, doing joint exercises, going essentially hunting submarines, which guess who they're worried about and working together. So you see that change, which Shyam Saran, former Indian Foreign Secretary, who you worked very closely with during the Manmohan Singh government in the 2000s, will say, I mean, there are things on the defense and security and the strategic side that he did not think would be happening that India's ended up doing with the US. And I think, in fact, I would argue that the most sensitive parts of the relationship, defense and security, etc., have perhaps outpaced what I had expected. It is, as Josh White, who's another scholar practitioner on South Asia, said, it's become the load-bearing pillar of the relationship. The disappointment, I think, has been the economic side, where it hasn't kept up. But even there, the US is India's largest single market for its goods. India has gone up into the US's top 10 list of trading partners. On the investment side, you've seen a lot more companies. And to me, when I go to, say, a Tata Lockheed factory that is producing the tails, every one of the tails of every one of the C-130s now produced in the world is produced in an Indian factory in a joint venture. That's not just a defense and security and a trusted relationship. That's also an economic relationship. It's creating jobs. It is, and for American companies, it's ensuring market access and more resilient supply chains. So I think the granularity sometimes gets missed when we are focusing just on that strategic side. But to me, the depth and breadth of the relationship is very much there. It is, I would argue, more important just if you look at metrics for India than it is for the US. But I think it's also become important than it was 5-10 years ago, even for the US.
A lot of these things the public and even scholars don't see or notice. Defense industrial relations are really important glue in strategic alignment. Another one that I know you track is the intelligence relationship. The CIA and the research analysis wing were basically adversaries until about 15, 20 years ago. Not the trust of the Five Eyes, to be sure, but a different kind of relationship. And the technology piece, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the most difficult parts of the NSSP, of the comprehensive effort to reset relations with India in the Bush administration. And we're dropping a lot of names, but Ken Juster was in charge of that, later became ambassador, and it was hard work in it. These are the kind of comprehensive lines of effort in technology and space and defense and energy and agriculture, across the board. They didn't all work, but it really put a lot of structure over time into the relationship. Okay. Episode 4 or 5 or whatever, we tune in and what the heck just happened? Not for structural reasons, I think you'd agree, for largely gratuitous and leadership reasons. Donald Trump just has a rupture with Modi. What's your take on what happened?
I'd been struggling to think about what the word for whatever happened 6 months ago or so was.
We're a family-friendly podcast, so the words we both want to use, we can't use.
I'll keep it family-friendly. I think about it less as a rupture than a chat, or even a crisis for that matter, and think of it as a challenging moment for the relationship, where you did have, I would say, a confluence of 3 kind of broader factors, which was just issues that came up, which was the India-Pakistan crisis in spring, and the Indian sense that President Trump declared a ceasefire and was taking credit for it, but also related to that, had started to see India's rival Pakistan, who India sees as responsible for looking the other way or actively encouraging terrorist groups based in Pakistan to attack Indian interests. You saw India see a Trump administration that's been reaching out to the Pakistanis, working with them on things like crypto and critical minerals, in some senses counterterrorism as well. So for India, that kind of Pakistan factor combined with the US approach towards the end of the India-Pakistan crisis. The second, I think, was for the US. I think India had expected on the Russia side that a President Trump who actually wanted an accommodation with Russia, with President Putin, would make the Russia difference between India and the US less of a problem. But what you saw is, nonetheless, in Washington, the sense that India's, especially oil imports from Russia, were part of what was keeping Putin from coming to the table. Now, as we know, there's a lot of other reasons. But nonetheless, then you had President Trump start to criticize India's oil imports. And even though China's oil imports and it's just economic relationship with Russia are far greater, targeting India with putting kind of 25% additional tariffs, which India saw and some people in the Trump administration referred to as a sanction on India, which was new it hasn't happened for a while. The US had done this. And then I think you saw the differences on trade, which is this attempt to try to get, and these trade differences, they go back to not just the Bush administration, but the Clinton administration. And, I've been going through Reagan and H.W. Bush administration papers, and they go back to the period then. But all these trade frictions that for a president who has called India the tariff king, saying that, he wanted a trade deal and pressing India on that, and then using tariffs and saying, I'm putting 25% tariffs in India. So India ends up with, in some areas, with some exemptions, a 50% tariff rate, which is more than pretty much every other country, including, I think, in parts China. And so I think those were the discrete issues. But I think there were these two broader issues above that. There are two elements. One was a new element and one was a missing element. The new element was President Trump's personal pique at India, at least seeming personal pique at India, for not, in his view, acknowledging the role he said he played in bringing India and Pakistan to a ceasefire. And I think particularly Pakistanis nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize. But not only did India not do that, the sense that India was denying that he played a role in India being very sensitive about, yes, the US passed messages, but India and Pakistan made these decisions. And so I think that personal pique was a new element. I think the missing element was China. The US and India have had these major differences on various issues in the Biden administration. It was things like India's approach to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was allegations of murder for hire plots. It was other issues that India was upset about on some things to do with Pakistan. But you saw that because of the strategic convergence on China, you saw that incentivize the two countries to manage their differences and focus on the cooperation. You saw this in the first Trump administration too. Those trade differences were there too. But you saw that vision or that desire to compete with China and do so in cooperation with each other meant that those differences were managed or mitigated. What you haven't seen in this Trump term is that idea in the Trump administration, particularly the president's part, that there is a single-minded view of this desire to compete with, balance China. We get competing signals on this from different people, but the president himself seeking a deal with China. I think this missing element meant that incentive structure wasn't there for both the US and in India to say, especially in the US, for people to say, let's try to manage those differences and not let them get out of control. Now, I don't think it's entirely missing, but I think at that crucial moment in July, August, both that personal pique from the president's part, and then, you saw this. So end results being, you have this 50% tariff on India, the US talking about sanctioning India, President Trump talking about India having a dead economy. And given the skepticism in the Indian system in any case, often about the US, which a lot of people have overcome there, but nonetheless, again, you started hearing in India this thing about the US is not a reliable partner. The US is sanctioning and coercing us and weaponizing interdependence. And you heard them say, look, we were worried about overdependence on supply from, say, China, but now we have to worry about overdependence on our sources of demand, which they were alluding to. It was the US because it's 20% of India's market. And so it's been a challenging moment. What has been interesting, though, is the easy conclusion is, oh, this is such a fragile relationship. What has been striking, though, is there's no doubt it's been challenging, and there's nothing inevitable about the US and India finding their way out of it. Having said that, if this had happened, these same set of things had happened 5, 10, definitely 15, 20 years ago, if these things had happened, all the cooperation between the US and India would have stopped. Especially anything sensitive would have stopped. So there's no doubt that there's damage, there's scars that people will have for a while. Some might not heal. But what you've seen is functional cooperation continue, whether it is on critical minerals, whether it is sophisticated military exercises that are taking place, whether it's even some defense sales, whether it is economic deals being signed, including some $15 billion deals that American companies have announced there. So to me, yes, it shows that the US India relationship is not as robust as we might have liked. There are still questions, there's still hesitations, but at the same time, it is more resilient than some might have thought too.
I think the journalistic and scholarly and analytical commentary on the Trump impact is right about trust. I mean, what you described in India is true in Australia or Japan or certainly Europe. It's even true in China and North Korea, that the U.S. is seen as not trustworthy right now. The polls show the lowest level of trust in the U.S. ever among U.S. allies. That's pretty clear. I think what a lot of people miss is what you just pointed out, and it's even more true with treaty allies, how resilient the institutional, military, economic relationships are. Damage? Sure. And you're right to point out that that would not have been the case 20 years ago. George Shultz described the diplomacy of alliance building like gardening. Not a lot of drama, just going out every day to day and building over time a truly wonderful thing. And as you know, President Trump paved over the rose garden. He's not into gardening. I think he views this as a waste of time. It's what have you done for me lately? And Pakistan did something for him. Crypto, nominating for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think Prime Minister Modi explained he could not do that. He could not say politically in India, even if it were true, which it really wasn't entirely true, that the U.S. had somehow saved India and Pakistan from each other. But don't you think Prime Minister Modi was stunned? Because he had one of the best relationships with President Trump in the first term of any world leader. He did that famous Howdy Modi rally with Trump in Texas. Their politics kind of intertwined. He must have been absolutely stunned by this.
I think he clearly was, because I think there was an expectation that India had managed the first Trump term and could manage this term, that India had figured out how to work with a Trump team. But I think also it is interesting that even as all these troubles, President Trump still talks about how he really likes Prime Minister Modi and likes India. But in some ways, you didn't see this get personal in public, at least largely. But nonetheless, I'm sure it was something that shocked the Prime Minister. And not only that, there is the, if you are suddenly elevating a relationship, and you've seen both Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, as you said, deserves a lot of credit. He put his government on the line for the US relationship, but Prime Minister Modi as well, who have said, both in different words, that for India's objectives, the US isn't indispensable. And so if that US relationship becomes complex, and Prime Minister Modi has invested personally a lot on it, politically a lot on it, you then have the concern that this relationship you have spent a lot of time tending goes from becoming an asset, and particularly a political asset, to a political vulnerability. And it also makes your China problem tougher, because you had depended on the US to help you balance out that China problem. So, it becomes suddenly your jobs problem is tougher, your economic problem is tougher, and your China problem is tougher, not to mention your political problem. So I am sure that it has been a shock. And because of the reasons that I just outlined, that the government understands that the US remains important to India's objectives, you did not see the Prime Minister react and show quite a bit of patience, even when others in India have said, you should push back, you should react, kind of just not doing that. I will just say one thing about the first Trump term, and this is why, again, history is important, even recent history. There's a lot of nostalgia about that first Trump term, but I drew up a list of all the things that were quite difficult for India-US relations, even in the first Trump term, and that list is not short. There was an India-Pakistan crisis then. President Trump also went and announced a ceasefire before anybody else did then. He welcomed Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan to the White House. He had a moment during the Mar-a-Lago summit of doing a deal with China. He put additional tariffs on India. He insulted Prime Minister Modi then. So I think the overall picture ended on a good note, but it took, as you said, a lot of nurture on the parts of people like NSC Senior Director Lisa Curtis, Randy Schreiber in the early years in the Defense Department, of Ken Juster, who was ambassador, a lot of cabinet principals then, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, national security advisors, who saw this as being an important relationship. So, as you know, people keep saying natural allies for the relationship. I always say there's nothing natural about it. It requires nurture, as you're saying, the tending, the constant gardening. And it is a high maintenance relationship, but clearly both sides have thought it's been worth it. But I wonder if there were times in the last few months where Prime Minister Modi wondered if it was.
Well, you mentioned some important players in the first Trump term who shored up the relationship despite all of the challenges that the president himself was throwing in their way. And you don't have the same level of commitment to alliances and international diplomacy that you did. I wonder if you have also a more nefarious force in the second Trump term that impacts India, and that's the anti-immigrant culture war dimension of MAGA. You've probably followed this, but there's a war within MAGA over ideology, race, and India's caught in it. Vivek Ramaswamy and the tech bros who want visas for Indian workers because they need it for their companies, need it for the U.S. economy, are fighting with other right-wing elements of MAGA who are very racist and anti-immigration. I suspect very strongly that Stephen Miller, the very powerful player in the White House, is not a friend of India in this fight. That is clearly a minority and in some ways almost fringe view, but very powerful right now. Do you think that's part of what may have sort of poisoned the well a bit, as in addition to the things you mentioned?
I think this is going to be, and I suspect even if we have the US and India working out of some of the other differences, whether on trade, whether moving forward on other, we're seeing the kind of anti-Indian hate online, but also of seeing Indian immigrants as a problem in parts, and as you said, in consequential and influential parts of the administration, not to mention the MAGA movement, that will leave a legacy. And I worry that this is going to move from the online space to the streets at some point. It's hard to know. There's sometimes I wonder if some of it is clearly organic, but some of it you wonder if there are bots and feeding this. There are folks who would have an interest in doing it. Whatever it is there. And it is partly, I think, from some who don't like legal migration, for some who think anybody who's not Christian doesn't belong, from some who just think Indian culture is alien somehow. The viciousness that you're seeing, and even from some who you would expect to speak out against it, you're seeing them stay silent, including folks like the vice president whose own wife is Indian American and whose kids are half Indian. It is our seeing, you've seen, for example, governors who a few months ago when the festival of Diwali was on, who hosted events because they have large Indian communities. Still very small compared to most others. The kind of reaction they got from some people about this, and Republican governors, not just Democratic governors, you did see pushback. Now, this is somewhat ironic for the fact that President Trump got more Indian American votes than any Republican president before him did, or Republican candidate before him did. There was a swing from Democrats to Republicans. It's not a huge community in percentage terms, but you do hear a lot of regret from some of those voters for having voted for the president. I wonder if it'll show up in the midterms as well. But I think beyond any political reason, it is sad to see because, as you said earlier, this was part of the bridge. And you don't want it to become a barrier, not just for the relationship, but where it becomes, honestly, a safety issue for Indians and Indian Americans here. And beyond anything to do with that, you're also hearing talk of not just what to do about high-skill visas, but also not wanting international students here. This is not just an India issue, but also taking away the work visa components. So you will see, I think, potentially decreases in numbers of international students here, which will affect universities, especially those who do a lot of research and development. As I was saying, most Indian students who come here are graduate students. I visited Birmingham, Alabama not so long ago, and the university there has a medical research facility, and they have, not just Indian students, but from a number of countries. So this is not kind of a blue state issue. This is it's not a good thing just for the sake of it, but also just from a very kind of American interest point of view in terms of technology and innovation, it's not a great sign.
As you know, historically, anti-immigration racism and politics in the U.S. has had a devastating effect on American strategy. The positions taken in California against Japanese immigrants in 1904 almost led to a war. People sort of have forgotten that historically. Or the position on Chinese immigrants or the Alien Exclusion Acts in the 1920s. All of these were contributing factors in the breakdown of international order and war. This is not that bad. We should put it in perspective. It's not that bad. I mean, the India caucus in the U.S. Congress is the second largest after APAC with Israel. There's very broad bipartisan support. The diaspora matters a lot. But this sort of ugly dimension, I think, is a factor. Maybe we can take some comfort in the fact that MAGA is in an absolute civil war over it. Like they're eating their own, as you point out, they're eating their own constituencies, support base, voters with this stuff. But it is a factor worth watching. The final episode in this miniseries, first few were amazing. Then we had this shocking, horrible, we don't have a word for it yet. We'll call it not rupture, but shock. And then before we recorded this, President Trump announces a trade deal with India. So we don't know exactly at this point how enduring it is, but how does this all end? What happens next? And what happens to the Quad, which did not get much prominence in the national security strategy, but we know Marco Rubio has always been a strong advocate of the Quad. So give us a little bit of predictions about what might come next for India with the U.S.
I prefer scenarios rather than forecasts, especially
fair
in this
enough.
administration, even in normal times, but especially with this administration. One scenario is that we have the broad sense that there's a trade agreement. They have to work out, to put it in an Indian English term, modalities. But what I think, if you do see a trade agreement announced, which at the kind of base level we know would bring down India's tariff rate from 50% to 18%, which not just it would be good for India because it's down from 50%, but it's also competitive. It's lower than other Southeast Asian and South Asian countries and number of India's other competitors. We need more market access for American goods and companies, apparently, which we haven't got details of. More India easing up on some non-tariff barriers. Broadly, I think this would be good in two senses. One, I think the lack, or rather this kind of 50% tariff rate, especially that 25% sanction, so to speak. If you think about a pipe and water flowing through this and that being the relationship, this was kind of like something like just gumming up the works. And so it wasn't that water wasn't moving, but things had slowed down. Also, you weren't putting, more water through the system. Everybody was kind of waiting, whether it was on new initiatives, whether it was in some companies holding on investment. I think if this clears that clog, then you start to see other parts of the relationship move ahead as well. To me, the other good thing, if this actually comes to fruition, it would come at a time that India has also done an actual trade agreement with very legal terms on the European side. So there's an India-Europe free trade agreement. This is the largest trade agreement both have ever done. But India already has an existing agreement with Australia. Hopefully, there will be a next phase of that negotiated. India's signed a free trade agreement with New Zealand and others that you see in India that as part of these agreements, especially the ones with EU and potentially the US, is agreeing to open up in a way that it has not in the past. This will be good for the Indian economy, in my view, but it will facilitate the strengthening of the economic pillar of the India-US relationship, not just in trade, but also you'll have American companies now say, okay, we have a little bit more certainty. We will now go ahead with those investments. You will also see that technology pillar potentially continue to strengthen because you will see again this sense that, okay, there's still damage in terms of trust, etc., but playing the long game in this relationship, that this is where the future lies. So I think there are two ways this could be if this actually goes through. Now, these are with all the caveats that we don't have deals, that President Trump changes his mind all the time, that something else could accept him. But I think the other part of the kind of if that I have in my head is some of the other problems that I mentioned haven't gone away, which is the Pakistan issue is still there. And if there's another crisis, what will the U.S. role be? That will determine how the ceiling of U.S. India ties, but also particularly how the president's trip to China goes, what he agrees with Xi Jinping. That, I would argue, India watches that as closely as it does what happens in, say, U.S.-India relations, and definitely more than what happens in U.S.-Pakistan relations. I don't think, everything's been papered over. I think there's still real things to work through, but it could be a positive side. Now, the negative could be if you have a situation where the president, between kind of just the communication of this deal or something else that upsets, the president says, just like he has with South Korea or others, that, well, India has not gone to zero on imports of Russian oil, or India says, too much market access has been given, where you start to see then this sense of disillusionment on both sides set in. So I'm hoping we're in the kind of first round, but volatility is the one constant these days. So the jury is out on where I'll go. But I will say if even the announcement of a deal is a positive sign and will hopefully help mean that it won't lower the floor of that U.S.-India relationship and potentially mean that we can raise that ceiling of the relationship a bit more.
Your next research project will bring you to Japan and with us in Australia. And so you're looking at the Quad and India's alignment with the other major maritime democracies. So I gather you have a very good instinct for what matters as a scholar. So I gather you're bullish on the Quad. You think it's
I didn't answer that, but I do think so. To me, I've always thought, and the fact that you were present at the creation, Mike, of Team Quaddy OG. The fact that it came back, it got revived, tells me there was structural reasons for it. And to me, no minilateral should be a self-licking ice cream cone that should just exist for the sake of existing. It should exist if there is buy-in, if the countries think it's worthwhile. It's ended up facilitating, whether or not you have Quad summits, I think it's already facilitated coordination and cooperative mechanisms that will continue in some form. Now, I hope that we will see a persistence of the Quad because I think there's actual cooperation and coordination that's useful, but also it's a good signal to China. Nothing worries China more in terms of India and the US than the Quad. So I think it's a good signaling device. But even if you don't have the summits, you've seen in the last few months, the Quad ambassadors meet regularly in Beijing, and Ambassador Perdue tweeted about it. The Quad, they don't like to call it a Quad exercise, but the Malabar exercise, the maritime exercise took place. It was more sophisticated. It had elements of anti-submarine warfare operations. The Coast Guards continued their new kind of initiative. And so I think you're seeing there's less fragility and more resilience that you might have otherwise thought, even though you might not have summits or even ministerials. But I think if the U.S.-India relationship stabilizes, because I think there's a feedback. The Quad has been important for the bilaterals, but it cannot exist without the bilaterals being somewhat strong. So I think the U.S.-India relationship stabilizes somewhat. I think that opens the door to doing more in the Quad. But the project that I'm going to be working on also tells you that one thing the Quad has helped facilitate is the bilaterals amongst the other countries. So India, Japan, Australia, India, and Japan and Australia. And so that's what one of the things I'm going to be working on is what's been happening in those relationships on the defense and security side, on the economic security side, on the technology side. So for me, the logic for the Quad still remains, whether it's on critical minerals, on technology, on economic security, on defense and security, on the power balance in the region. And so whether or not you're going to have summits, I think in some form or shape, it will continue.
We will be looking for your research so we can understand the direction of travel. But I tend to agree with you. I think the Quad, look, it's been in worse shape over its history. There is a lot under the surface, and there will be reasons when leaders, including Donald Trump, are going to want it. But we'll see. Tanvi Madan, Brookings Institution, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.